And we're back, this time with some T-charts. So we're looking at a bank's balance sheet, and we have assets and liabilities. Assets refer to anything that you own with an N at the end. Liabilities are what you owe. So let's think about a bank's perspective on the world. And who do banks owe money to? Primarily, banks owe money to their depositors. If you open a checking account and you put in $100, does that mean the bank owes you $100? And the answer is yes, they do. So the primary liability of banks are often referred to as demand deposits. And we're going to think about these as checking account deposits. It's going to come in handy later to think about them as checking account deposits. Assets are what a bank owns. If I go to a bank and I hand them a $100 bill to put into, I wish I had a $100 bill to do that. Let me look. I don't. You hand them a $100 bill, they take your $100 bill and they put it in the drawer, in the vault, wherever. And now, are they actually holding the $100? Do they have $100? The answer is yes, they have $100 in currency, so it is an asset. So it is simultaneously a liability, they owe me $100, and simultaneously they're holding $100. They have it in their hand. So let's first talk about a cash deposit and what happens. So who's going to be our depositor? Let's say this is, Sean. Sean gets a $100 bill from his aunt for his birthday. He's a very responsible young man. He takes that $100 bill and he's going to deposit it into his checking account. Immediately the bank notes that he has deposited a $100 bill into his checking account. Does he have this anymore? So when he does that, he no longer holds that. Instead, what he's holding is an electronic ledger of his checking account deposit. Let's go back to what we understand about M1. What makes up M1? M1 is the money supply, and money is made out of currency, checking account deposits, and traveler's checks, which, like rodents of unusually large size, frankly, I don't think exist. If you have one, kudos to you. I don't. I've never even seen one. That being said, at the beginning of our story, we had $100 of M1, which was currency, and it transformed itself into $100 of checking account deposits. So to begin our story, the total value of M1 was $100. Now let's see what's going to go down here. As Sean deposits his $100, the bank simultaneously gets $100 into its reserves. Now becomes the story that's interesting. How do banks make money? Banks make money by lending money and charging interest, so banks are in the business of taking their reserves and lending them. Are there rules as to what fraction of reserves can be lent? And the answer is yes, it is governed by the Federal Reserve, who sets the reserve requirement. For this scenario, we are going to use a 10% reserve requirement. The reason I chose that is because it's real easy for me to do the math of 10%. We look at this, and of the $100, with a 10% reserve requirement, the reserve requirement refers to the fraction of deposits that must be held in reserves, that the bank is not allowed to lend, that they have to hold on to and keep safe. So 10% of 100 means that required reserves are $10, and excess reserves, meaning reserves the bank is holding beyond their requirement, 100 minus 10 is 90. This 90 is going to come in handy because this 90 is where the action is going to happen. What did I say banks do to make money? They make loans. So this 90 is going to want to migrate down here. It's going to want to become $90 of loans. Here's where it gets super interesting. How are loans issued? Loans are issued as checking account deposits. So if the bank loans Sean $90 to buy a used e-scooter, they're going to give him the $90 in the form of a checking account deposit. Wait a minute. Are what you So when they do that, do the reserves, at this moment, the reserves drop down to 10. Required is still 10 at the $100 deposit, but the second this 90 hits, our deposits are 190, and this 90 goes back over here, that becomes 100. What's gonna change is the 10% of 190 is no longer 10. Now, what we're looking at is 10% of 190 is 19. Now our excess reserves are 81. Maybe I should use a different color for this, just to help a little. Now we have $81 of excess reserves. What do you think the bank's gonna wanna do? Oh, that's right. They're gonna wanna lend that 81, joins over here. Now we're at 271. All right, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. I find this process a little tedious because the 81 goes back here, that becomes 100 again. Our reserve requirement is now going to be, our required reserves will be $27.10, leaving us a $76.90 excess. I don't want to do that anymore. That starts to get like, woo, that's a little sloppy. It's getting a little ugly. So I want to hit the rewind button. And I want to go back to where we started. And I want to use a little cheat. Now, the cheat assumes that the bank does maximum lending. It is the potential of what a $100 deposit can become. Do banks in the real world always do maximum lending? The answer is no. This is a model of a perfect scenario. So we are assuming maximum lending. We have a $100 cash deposit. We have a 10% reserve requirement. We can use the deposit multiplier formula. Our deposit multiplier formula is 1 over the reserve requirement. In this case, it's 10x. Meaning that if we had followed out that path of deposit, excess, loan, deposit, excess, loan, deposit, excess, loan, you notice that each round the loans got smaller, and that's the rate of entropy determined by the siphoning of the reserves from each round. We can get to the end assuming maximum lending with this formula. So a $100 deposit would be subject to a 10x deposit multiplier formula, which is going to bring us to $1,000. We know that the reserves, if given maximum lending, the reserves 10% of 1,000 is going to be $100. That's $100 of required. There's no excess because they lent everything they could, and we know that the difference is $900 in loans. And the way that happened was through this relationship that deposits become reserves, excess reserves become loans, loans become deposits. The deposit multiplier triangle, as I like to call it. Assuming maximum lending with a 10% reserve requirement, a $100 cash deposit becomes $1,000 in checking account deposits. In this scenario, did the bank create money? Money is M1. Therefore, the bank did create money because the bank has the power to create checking account deposits through loans which are issued as checking account deposits. We go back now, and we see that at the beginning of our story, we had $100 of M1 currency that immediately was transformed into $100 of checking account deposits, and through the checking account deposit, excess reserve, lending, redeposit triangle, we came to the conclusion that what began as $100 is going to end as $1,000 of M1. Did M1 change? The answer is yes. M1 increased by $900. With a 10% reserve requirement, a $100 cash deposit can increase the money supply by $900 when the money supply becomes $1,000. And this, my friends, is the miracle of banking. Is this the whole story? It's not the whole story. Let's erase this and let's go back and let's look at the bank's relationship with the world from another vantage point. And we'll start with a zero balance bank just to make it simple. And we're no longer dealing with Sean. Now, we're dealing with the Fed, the Central Bank of the United States. the three tools of the Fed: setting the reserve requirement, setting the discount rate, and open market operations. Open market operations consists of, to keep it simple, the buying and selling of financial assets. Why does the Fed buy and sell financial assets? Primarily, which we're focusing on bonds, US government debt obligation. The Fed buys and sells bonds to control the money supply. And when we talk about the money supply, we're talking about M1. So let's see how the Fed does that. If the Fed wants to, we gotta go back a second. When the United States government runs a deficit, how do they do that? How do they spend money that they don't have? Well, they do it the same way everybody does. How do you spend money that you don't have? You have to borrow. How do governments borrow money? They borrow money by selling bonds. Who do they sell bonds to? Well, they primarily sell bonds to private banks. When Treasury needs money because the United States government spends more than they collected in taxes, they sell bonds to banks. Why do they sell bonds to banks? Because banks have a lot of money. The United States government is going to be in like $5 trillion of deficit this year. That might be hyperbolic, but it might not be. I don't know. We're in a crazy place right now. Where do you get $5 trillion? Who has $5 trillion? Private banks have $5 trillion. If you need to borrow a lot of money, you need to go to the private banks of the United States. You need to go to other governments of the world, pension systems, major institutions that have huge amounts of money. These are the primarily direct purchasers of bonds from the government. So let's say that right now this bank is holding $100 of bonds. Big time bank. The Fed wants to increase the money supply. They are going to purchase those $100 bonds. The Fed does not do business with the United States government. They do business with private banks. In exchange for the $100 worth of bonds, what is the Fed going to be doing? They're going to give the bank $100. The Fed is then going to give the bank $100 in exchange for that, and that money is going to go into excess reserves. Why excess reserves? Well, it's not a deposit. The Fed isn't opening an account with the bank. They're buying a bank's asset, and they're transforming the form of that asset from a debt obligation from the United States government into checking account deposits. They're depositing directly into the bank, but they're not a demand deposit holder. They're just giving the bank $100 of money. And that means the bank is going to hold it in excess reserves. When the bank sells the bond, it transforms into excess reserves. Are excess reserves subject to the reserve requirement? Negative, Ghost Rider, the pattern is full. Demand deposits are what the reserve requirement refers to. The bank is allowed to lend all of its excess reserves. So assuming maximum lending, the bank would lend this $100 in the form of a checking account deposit, which would become reserves, and we, my friends, have re-entered the deposit multiplier formula. Just like our previous $100 times 10 becomes $1,000, only this time, what's our change to M1? Was any of this initial $100 purchase of bonds previously part of the money supply? And the answer is no, because the Fed exists outside of the money supply. The Fed is like a black hole. What comes out of it is all new. So this is all new money. This initial loan of the $100 didn't exist in the money supply before. It wasn't currency, it wasn't a checking account deposit, and it wasn't traveler's checks. It's this money that comes out of the Fed. And so the new money, subject to the deposit multiplier, becomes $1,000 of new money. And so when the Fed buys bonds, money can increase by the full amount of the deposit multiplier. It's a $1,000 change to M1. How does this look? Why is the Fed doing this? Well, let's go back to a little monetary policy review. We have money supply, money demand, nominal interest, quantity money. As the Fed buys bonds, the money supply increases. I1 to I2, the interest rate falls. which is how the Fed chooses to target its affective influence on the economy as a whole. And we're going to look at that in a little bit.